Just confirm if we are live.
Yeah, we're getting a notice.
Yeah, okay. Sure, yeah. So we're live. Okay. And let me just send an update in the group as well that we're live. All right. So, hello and welcome to a new edition of the Tasil Commons podcast. I'm your host, Saad Ismail, and joining us today is Professor Juan Cole. Today, our discussion is going to be about Professor Cole's recent book, which is a translation of the poetry of Omar Khayyam. And previously, of course, about a month back, we had the professor to discuss another brilliant book of his on the life of the Prophet Muhammad. A brief introduction to the professor for those who might not be aware. Professor Juan Cole is the prophetic ethos seems just a second. So Professor Juan Cole is Richard P. Mitchell Collegiate Professor of History at the University of Michigan. For 3.5 decades, he has sought to put the relationship of the West and the Muslim world in historical context. He is the author of Muhammad, Prophet of Peace Amid the Clash of Empires, as well as many other books, including The New Arabs, Engaging the Muslim World, and Napoleon's Egypt. He is the editor and creator of the award-winning Informed Comment news and commentary website. He has made various television, radio, and press appearances. He has written widely about Egypt, Iran, Iraq, and South Asia. Professor Cole commands Arabic, Persian, Urdu, and reads Turkish. He has translated works of the Lebanese-American author Khalil Gibran. And of course, his most recent translation is of Omar Khayyam's Persian, Rubaiyat. Thank you, Professor, for joining us again. Thank you for your time.
Thanks for having me on, Saad. It's always good to talk to you.
Thank you. So, well, your book is a new translation of Omar Khayyam's poetry, and you do it in free verse. But apart from the translation, what is also valuable in your book is the epilogue and the introduction that you give to the contextualization that you give. You go into some length about the origins or the sources of these quatrains, and about who the author might have been. And but before we go into those discussion, I was really fascinated to read the introduction where you talk about the influence, the great influence that this poetry has had on some of the major thinkers and intellectuals and artists of the 20th and 19th century, or is it also before that?
Starting in 1859.
Yeah, of course, yeah. So could you perhaps say a little bit about that? Because for me, as a person situated in at this point in history, the Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam is not perhaps the most. I mean, we're not necessarily as familiar with that as compared to some other poets who have gained more popularity in our times, like Rumi. But you mentioned that just a generation before, the Rubaiyat had that status, and it had a greater status at that point. So could you mention about that trajectory?
Yeah, from the late 19th into the mid 20th century, the Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam, as translated by the Victorian gentleman Edward Fitzgerald, was the most famous poem in the English language.
Yeah,
it was cited widely. Attorneys would use it in their summations. Politicians would cite it in their speeches. It was taught in school in the United States and often in Britain in that era. And so people knew it. The famous Bartlett's quotations had more entries under the Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam than under the Bible. So it was just enormously well known and beloved. People gave it as gifts at holidays, and at one point, around 1900, it was estimated that there was a new printing of it every single day of the year. It is a little bit mysterious why people always wanted to have the latest printing of the Fitzgerald translation, because it wouldn't be different than the earlier printings. But of course, people experimented with illustrations and with typefaces, and but it was a craze. It's hard always to understand it. It became part of popular culture. It invaded the early 20th century world of advertising. So there was Omar Khayyam wine. There still is in Turkey. There was Omar Khayyam cigarettes, Omar Khayyam this, Omar Khayyam that. There were even jokes about this, how prevalent it was in the world of advertising. It was set to music. Some of the first gramophone recordings were of the Rubaiyat as sung by then famous singers. It was set to dance by Isadora Duncan. It was there were stage plays. There were what were called tableaus. People would get up on stage. There would be a kind of decorated stage, and they would take poses of the poetry, and then it would be read out. It was enormously influential in letters. All of the pre-Raphaelite poets were influenced by it, and as well as their successors. Robert Frost imitated it. His poem, "Stopping by the Woods on a Winter Night," is a homage to the Fitzgerald translation. It's in the same rhyme and meter, and with some of the same themes. T.S. Eliot says he started writing poetry under its influence. So it went everywhere. It was enormously influential. It was central in many ways to American culture, and to a lesser extent, but still importantly, to British culture. And then in the 1970s, the phenomenon began petering out. And it may be that the school teachers stopped assigning it in class because they were eager to move away from assigning dead white men. Although, of course, it's not fair to the Rubaiyats. And it was an early instance of multiculturalism, but they, wanted to have more room in the curriculum for African American writers, Latino writers, and so forth. And once it stopped being taught in the schools, in the last 50 years, its prominence in the West declined precipitously. So when I talk to someone in their 60s or older about my translation, they began quoting to me the Fitzgerald translation here in the United States. But if I talk to someone younger in their 20s or 30s, they often have never heard of it. So there's a very stark difference in that regard.
Yes, yeah, that's fascinating. And what I also find really fascinating is that some of these names that were really influenced by Omar Khayyam, some of these other big names, such as you mentioned that T.S. Eliot mentions that he begins writing poetry. His inspiration was Omar Khayyam, and Thomas Hardy asks his wife to recite from the Rubaiyat at his deathbed. And Arthur Conan Doyle puts Omarian or Omar Khayyamian kind of verses or kind of a message in the words of Sherlock Holmes. And I mean, for all this, it seems like no small, cultural element. And the fact that this has in present times we have lost sight of it, or that we have lost sight of the inheritance, the legacy of the Rubaiyats in that sense. Um, and yeah, what I also found really fascinating is that you mentioned that there were these Omar Khayyam clubs in both the US and the UK, and that major intellectuals and artists and writers were part of these clubs. And could you mention about that as well?
Sure. Well, in the 1890s, both in Britain and in the United States, in London and in Boston, Omar Khayyam clubs were formed, and they seem to have been upper class or upper middle class affairs. Arthur Conan Doyle, the author of the Sherlock Holmes stories, was a member. Thomas Hardy was a member. In the American Club, I went and looked at some of its archives, which are held at UCLA. Apparently, there were two major sorts of people that would come to these dinners. They would have annual dinners, and one were people who philosophically liked the Rubaiyat because they authorized unconventional morality. They challenged the prudishness of Victorian society. There was another group who liked them because they were free thinkers and they were scientists, or they were interested in science. They were Darwinists typically. So the Darwinists were among the big champions of this poetry. So these two groups weren't attracted to the poetry for exactly the same reasons, but they jokingly said that there were no major disputes amongst them when they had their annual dinners.
And you also mentioned that the Rubaiyat served as an aid for self-secularization in this period where, in this modern period where culture was trying to, where we had the emergence, we see the emergence of a post-religious culture. And in that context, this acquires great significance. Yeah.
Yes, that is my theory about it. Why was this poetry so enormously popular? Well, it was popular even with religious people, or at least with some of them. But I think in the late 19th, early 20th century, there were a lot of intellectuals who were brought up as churchgoers and who felt a little bit stifled by the intellectual discipline of their church. And the Rubaiyat opened a world of other possibilities. It's not really atheist poetry, and it has some spiritual dimensions to it, but it is often skeptical, scientific, and champions reason, and in some instances it does put down the hidebound character of conventional religion. So we know that there were many intellectuals in the United States and Britain who were thrown for a loop by the discoveries of the 19th century. It was in the 19th century that the archaeologists first found the dinosaur bones. And geology and archaeology went hand in hand, and they could tell that these were creatures who had lived millions of years before. Well, Bishop Ussher had counted up the generations mentioned in the Bible, and it estimated that the world was 6,500 years old. All of a sudden, from the 1850s, around the same time this poetry was first translated by Fitzgerald and published, intellectuals had to come to terms with the world being millions of years old and being much more vast than they had imagined from the Bible. And then the theories of Darwin and natural selection had become widespread, and they were a challenge initially to many believing people who thought, well, how did human beings get here? Well, God created Adam and Eve ex nihilo, and science was now saying, no, human beings evolved out of other primates who had evolved out of other lower animals. And the idea that human beings were related to the apes was difficult for people. There's a joke that there's a cocktail party among these Victorian gentle people, and in one circle, the men sit around and they explain to one of the ladies who's there that Darwin has shown that human beings are related to the apes. So she is alleged to have said, "Oh dear, let us pray that it is not so. But if it is so, let us pray that it does not become widely known."
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, that's fascinating. I suppose, Professor, we could get to some of the poetry.
Sure, I'd love to read some. Happen to have a copy right here.
Of course.
So here's a Khayyami poem. It says, "In monasteries, temples, and retreats, they fear hellfire and look for paradise. But those who know the mysteries of God don't let those seeds be planted in their hearts." So this poem is saying that it's shameful to be a believer, do good deeds only because you're afraid of going to hell otherwise, or because you're hoping for the delights of paradise. That those are insufficiently honorable motivations for doing good.
Yeah.
That it should be an ethical matter. This sentiment is, by the way, often met with in Sufi poetry, and the great early Sufi poet Rabia al-Adawiyya, the woman who was a contemporary of Hassan al-Basri, has a poem very similar to that. So let me go on. Signs of the zodiac. You give something to every jackass. You hand them fancy baths, millworks, and canals, while noble souls must gamble in hopes of winning their nightly bread. Who would give a fart for such a constellation? This is one of a number of poems that's attacking astrology. This Omar Khayyam poetry does not believe in astrology. Of course, it's attributed, incorrectly, I believe, but it's attributed to one of the greatest astronomers in world history. And astronomers knew that astrology is bunkum. So in that case, I think the poetry was attacking the notion that the stars set our fates. Here's my version of a very popular Fitzgerald verse. A book of poetry, some ruby wine, and you. And half a loaf of bread. I don't need any more. When you and I are curled up in the great outdoors, our bliss outshines the glories of an emperor. Let me just do one more. The turning heavens that bewilder us are the projector for a shadow play. The world's a lantern floodlit by the sun, and we are cutouts that go round and round. So some of this poetry, it really questions the meaning of life. Does it have any meaning? And are we really playthings of the divine, of our fates? At one point, we're compared to checkers that are moved around a board and then put away. And there's a lot of doubt in the poetry. There's also love poetry and an exaltation of romantic love as maybe the real meaning of life. So it says, whenever I repented, I backslid. I've closed the door of honor and of shame. Don't blame me if I've gone out of my mind, for I'm blind drunk on passion once again. I'll give you a final one. Flout all traditions and forget the law, but don't deprive the poor of your small gifts, or slander people, or break hearts. That's how you really get to heaven. So bring wine.
Amazing. Yeah. There's a lot of there's a lot to unpack over there, and well, I guess one central theme that I'm trying to understand is you mentioned these verses about his critique of his attack on astrology, but at the same time you also have some verses where faith and predestination is seen as something that's a reality. So how does this attack against astrology fit with that? But of course, I mean, it's also, I mean, the contradiction is also something inherent or intrinsic to the nature of the collection of the poetry.
Yeah, the poetry, I believe, is by many hands, and therefore inevitably contains contradictory sentiments. There are some verses that seem predestinate, to believe in predestination, while others seem not to. But the attack on astrology is different, because the verses that acknowledge predestination are talking about God's will. And the verses that attack astrology are attacking the idea that the stars determine our fate.
Mm.
So it's in the Persian original. And there's one of them that says that don't blame the stars and planets for your characteristics and your fate. You know how in astrology, you're Libra, so therefore you have certain characteristics. It says don't do that. It says those planets that you think are determining your fate are 1,000 times more helpless than you are. In Persian, it's Hazar bar bichari tarand. You can understand it in Urdu, I think, as well. So they're 1,000 times more helpless than you are. Now, this is a genuine insight from astronomy, which is that we know exactly where Mars will be at this instant next year, this time. We can predict it exactly. In fact, if you couldn't do that, then you couldn't go to the moon. But tell me, Assad, could we predict where you and I will be on July 18th, 2022?
Yeah.
Human beings are unpredictable. They're very complex. The human brain is the most complex thing we know in the universe. Stars are simple. They're just hydrogen explosions. But human brains are billions of synapses and cells and interactions. So this poetry, I think, has this is a genuine insight, and it's a genuine scientific insight coming to us from medieval Islamic science, that astrology makes no sense from that point of view.
Yeah. And this is also something I want to touch upon in conclusion, the kind of precociousness of this poetry, and the which might also be part of the scientific understanding of the time, and as well as because of the pluralism of that society, the skepticism that it allowed to flourish. This is something I would like to touch upon in conclusion. Another theme which also strikes me when you in one of the verses which you just recited, uh, where there are a lot of these verses in Omar Khayyam where, uh, of course, he's telling you that at the end life is short and ultimately meaningless, but within that, enjoy yourself while also being good and being a decent person, not harming others. But the kind of enjoyment that he encourages is very Epicurean in the sense that it is not. Uh, um, he invites you to appreciate the smaller pleasures of life. And for example, the verse even which you had just cited, where he's comparing the pleasures of a simple, having a glass of wine or being with your beloved compared to the treasures of a king of a palace. Yeah. So this Epicurean element seems, Umar Khayyam's poetry seems Epicurean in that sense.
Yes, well, many of the poems have that shape, that they're pushing back against, I think, an ascetic point of view, that this world is worthless, it's base, degraded, a kind of Platonic view that the high ideals of the other world are what we should strive for. This is a sentiment you often see in Rumi, and that we should repress ourselves. We should be ascetics, the ideal of the Zahid in some Muslim literature. And this poetry is fighting back against that sentiment. It does have a sense of morality, so it's not libertine. It's not saying make yourself happy no matter what. As you say, it says don't harm other people. Don't make anybody sad if you can possibly avoid it. Don't backbite people. Don't put them down. Don't think you're better than they are. On the other hand, like John Stuart Mill, I think the poetry has a conception of victimless crimes, of victimless sins. And those, the poetry thinks there's nothing really very wrong with. So is it forbidden in a strict Islamic law to have a glass of wine? Well, yes, of course. But is there anything wrong with relaxing with a glass of wine? Not very much. From this poetry's point of view, and I think the wine there is symbolic of life's little pleasures that, if they were taken too far, would be sinful. But in measured doses, a little bit of rebellion, a little bit of acting out, a little bit of sin in this poetry is maybe a good thing. And then an acknowledgement of human weakness. Maybe you want to be good. Maybe you want to do the right thing. But maybe you're head over heels in love with someone your parents don't want you to marry. And of course, we wouldn't have any Bollywood films if that sentiment wasn't very widespread.
Yeah.
So there's a humanism to the poetry that gets away from a solely theological point of view, and sometimes makes fun of theologians and lawyers. And that was one of the things that attracted me to do a new translation of it, since the old Fitzgerald translation now I think seems a little distant to contemporary English speakers and has fallen out of favor with the public. But at this moment, where a lot of European and American thinkers have put Islam and Muslim civilization under the sign of religious fanaticism. I think this poetry is a powerful reminder that there were Muslim secularists in the medieval period. There were Muslim skeptics and there were Muslim scientists. And these were great traditions. They were important traditions which had knock-on effects. And even today, I suspect that the vast majority of Muslims in the world are somewhat humanist in their point of view. They're not hardline religious fundamentalists. Those are a minority. It's one of the reasons some of them become violent is because they're upset being so uninfluential. But it seems to me that this poetry, not only was it a great tradition in medieval Muslim civilization of skepticism, of hard thinking, of science, of examining, basic propositions of life, but also then when the Victorian world discovered it, they went wild for it themselves. And they were mostly church-going Christians who began reading it.
Yeah, I find this really fascinating that there was this culture of skepticism and this kind of thinking. And you also mentioned that. I mean, when I was reading it, it seemed very similar to Abul Ala al-Ma'ri, the Arab.
Yeah.
And of course, you also mentioned in the epilogue that some quatrains reflect some of those themes as well, and are influenced by that tradition. And
yes, in Arabic poetry, there were some skeptics. Al-Ma'ari was one of them, and he was from northern Syria, and he actually has quatrains. This trope that's in the Rubaiyat of, we're going to die and we'll become clay in the earth. Grass will grow out of us, trees will grow out of us. People will dig up the clay and they'll work it into clay pots and clay mugs. So there's a lot of playfulness with this idea that our future is to be clay. So one of the poems says that this cup with the handle is actually the lover, and the handle is his arm, reaching for his beloved. He still remembers her. Sometimes there's a sense of urgency in the poetry that they're in the tavern drinking, and one of them says, "We'll drink up quickly before we're the same clay that we're drinking out of," because they would drink from these clay mugs. So that trope of our clayey nature and our fate as clay, but then the recycling of the clay in the next generation, that's in al-Ma'ari's Rubaiyat. He has Rubaiyat. So there are some Arabic poetic influences on this Persian poetry.
I actually have Raynald Nicholson's translation of Ma'ari, and what also struck me as similar is the insistence on relishing the present moment rather than being in the past or in the future. I guess that is also a theme which is common to both of them.
Yes. Well, and moreover, that theme in some ways goes back to ancient Arab poetry, because the idea of the impermanence of life and seizing the moment, all of these things are in the mu'allaqat. They're in the epic battle days poetry of the ancient Arabs of the pre-Islamic period.
Yeah. I guess that what's also really fascinating is that you find all these multiple there's like a confluence of cultures coming into the Rubaiyats. You get some influences from the pre-Islamic Arab poetry, and of course you also mentioned that there's also a Chinese influence, which perhaps might have been a common source for both the Rubaiyat as well as the Japanese haiku,
Yeah.
right? So,
Well, one can only speculate really because it's very hard to nail these things down. But one question one has is where the Rubaiyat, which means quatrain, where this particular kind of quatrain comes from in Persian and Arabic poetry. And the great Italian scholar of Persian literature, Alessandro Balsani, wondered whether it wasn't a Turkic influence of the Turkmen who came into Central Asia on Persian. And in turn, the Turkic peoples were heavily under Chinese influence because they originated in East Asia. And there is a quatrain in Deng Dynasty Chinese poetry, which is evolves into the Japanese haiku. Of course, the haiku is 3 lines rather than 4, but it has its roots in that Chinese form. And so the Persian quatrain, if it was influenced by the Turkmen and ultimately then by the Deng Chinese quatrain, it may have the same ancestor as the haiku. And it has some similarities to haiku also in the sense that, the last line of haiku is supposed to be a little bit of a surprise. It's a shift in perspective or some new insight is put forward based on what has gone before. And you often find that kind of surprising last line in the Rubaiyat as well. And then once the Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam became enormously popular and many manuscripts were copied out and spread around, it became popular in India. And Akbar, the Mughal emperor, said that, reading an ode, a ghazal by Hafiz, is kind of like the main course. And afterwards, you should read some Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam because it's like the aperitif afterwards. It freshens the palate after a big meal. So Akbar really liked this poetry. And there are many Indian manuscripts. And we were talking about authorship. So over time, the Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam as a manuscript grows. The one that I translated had 158 poems in it. But then you get 400 and you get 500. And in 19th century Lucknow, where I lived for a while, there was a printing from the famous Nawal Kishore press of 1,000 quatrains or Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam. So he was very busy after his death. And Indian authors contributed, I think, many of these later Rubaiyat, but they would say, well, look, this old poem I found by Omar Khayyam, but of course they had actually written it themselves. And so you begin to get some Indian themes in the poetry. So there's a whole kind of Indian historical dimension of the spread of the Rubaiyat. When Fitzgerald's translation became very popular in the West, there were many specialists in Persian literature who said, well, the Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam is not a really well-known or beloved work in Persian literature. It's known, it exists, but it's not that popular. But I think they're wrong. There are lots of manuscripts of this work, and when people started lithographing Persian works, when Hafiz was first published in Persian in Calcutta or in Bombay or in Lucknow, they would put the Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam as one of the, they would publish several books together. So you would have Saadi and Hafiz and the Rubaiyat in these early printings. I think and this was before Fitzgerald, So I think that this is a signal that this poetry continued to be cultivated, but it wasn't. It was slightly disreputable, you know. It wasn't cultivated in the same way Sadi was. You would give Sadi to a school child, right, to learn morality and to learn Persian. You wouldn't give the Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam to a school child. So I think it was a little bit of a guilty pleasure.
Yeah, well, in that wider context of poets like Sadi and Hafiz, uh, there seems to be like a common element between, for example, someone like Hafiz and Omar Khayyam, where uh, I mean, you could say that, and well, I mean, for both of them, I guess even in Hafiz, wine is important or significant, not just in a metaphorical way, but also in a physical way, and of course, you mentioned in the book that it's better to see these things as a spectrum between the religious and the secular, and so I mean for that reason you also have these orthodox Sufi poets. I mean, talking in a similar vein and in this antinomian spirit.
Yeah, well, wine could be symbolic. So Sufi poets could use it to symbolize the intoxication that a worshiper gets from being close to God. And one of the ways that the Rubaiyat survived in Persian knowing societies like Iran and India and Central Asia was that if anybody challenged you for reading it, you could say, well, yes, it talks about drinking wine, but the wine is symbolic and it means God and so forth. But I think the difference between Hafez and this Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam is that in Hafez, there are times when wine really is symbolic. Whereas I think in this poetry, it never is. It's really wine. And, you know, medieval Muslims would mix wine with marijuana, with bhang, or with other drugs, maybe a little bit of opium. And it would give them visions. And so not only was it really wine, but sometimes it might be something a little bit more than just wine. It may be something that really gave you a visionary experience.
And well, there's also this tradition of wine drinking in the Muslim civilization, or in that culture, which was a part of that society much more than what the impression you would get if you just look at the Muslim civilization from a purely scriptural or purely text-based point of view. And this is also a point which the late Shahab Ahmed also points out in his book, What is Islam? Where and he is a self-professed wine drinking Muslim, and he shows that this tradition, this contradiction wasn't necessarily a contradiction at that time, and for, I mean, at least for a part of the society. So for example, you have people like Ibn Sina and Abu Zayd al-Balkhi, Nasruddin al-Tusi. Nasruddin Tusi also writes about the ethics of wine drinking. And I guess this is also a part of looking at Islam as a purely scriptural, purely text-based kind of phenomenon, rather than seeing it as a broader cultural. And I mean, religion and culture themselves were deeply enmeshed and very complex in that sense.
Yeah, it's also a matter of our view of the past being very much influenced by the present. So, you know, in modern times, you have efficient government. And so a government in a Muslim majority society can just outlaw alcohol,
Yeah.
under most circumstances. and can make it stick because they have a national police force and it's a law and people can't import it and they can't make it in stills and so forth. So the medieval world was not like that. Government was weak or often non-existent. You wouldn't even see the government unless they showed up to take taxes at the end of the year. And people often did what they wanted. And, you know, the clergy were sometimes influential in some places and times, but often villages didn't have ulama, they didn't have clergy. And so villagers did what they wanted. And if you go back and look at the British gazetteers, they used to put out these in the 19th century when they first became rulers of India. They would send colonial anthropologists around to describe villages that they now ruled. And they published masses of what were called gazetteers, which contained these descriptions of villages. And they're full of accounts of Muslim villagers getting drunk on Eid. That was how they celebrated Eid, you know, circa 1835. So it's very easy now in the light of our efficient, organized governments with police and rules and import controls and so forth to imagine medieval Muslim societies as much more pure than they actually were. In fact, they were quite individualistic. Customs differed from village to village. There was a large margin of maneuver for individuals as regards morality. So I think one of the liberating things about contemplating this poetic tradition, as with Shahab Ahmed's own book, is to rethink what Muslim civilization was, because it was much less rigid and regimented than people often now think.
Well, I'd just like to remind the viewers, if you have any questions, please send them to me or send them in the comment section. Yeah, let me also just send a reminder. Yeah, so I guess, yeah, I mean that's what's fascinating is that you have this is a discussion which we can eventually have at the end, and I guess we've really exhausted the entire range of your book. Of course, there are a lot more things to cover, but I suppose what I found also fascinating or similar. I mean, what I could read in reading Khayyam is that there are some elements which strike me as Epicurean. There's some elements which strike me as Stoic, in the sense of the Stoic resignation at an inconsiderate or uncaring fate and destiny. And there are also some elements which strike me as a genre which could be termed shikwa, something that Iqbal does, shikwa, I mean, complaint towards God. And there are some things which also strike me as closer to the Sufi experience of perplexity. I mean, in the face of the mysteries of the cosmos, the haira or the perplexity. And I mean, you have all these diverse elements which one can extract or one can decipher or read in this poetry. One of the reasons, of course, is also that Khayyam was not the author of it in that sense. And could you speak a bit about that? I guess we haven't touched upon that. And about
Khayyam himself was a historical figure. He was a great astronomer, and he was attached to the Seljuk court, the great Turkic empire that ruled what is now Iran and part of Turkey and so forth in the medieval period. And Khayyam died 1132 of the Common Era. So he wrote on astronomy and wrote important books also on mathematics. When I was in high school, they had us do some algebraic geometry, where you use geometry to solve algebra problems, because sometimes it's easier if you can see the problem. And so you would make the algebraic equation into a circle, for instance. Well, Khayyam invented that. He invented algebraic geometry. So he was a genius. And after his death, well, and there was a contemporary of his who wrote a short biography of him, or mentioned him a couple of times, and Nizami Aruzi, who in his 4 essays, Chahar Maqale, it talks about Khayyam, and there's no mention of him writing any poetry or of him being known, for being a libertine or Epicurean. And it's only decades after his death that you begin to have a few quatrains attributed to him. And one of our greatest experts in Persian literature in America, Dick Davis, says that he doesn't think that Khayyam probably wrote any Persian poetry at all. And so I think there was a folk process where people used Khayyam as what's called a frame author. It's like in the 1001 Nights. You have all of these tales from medieval periods. Some are from Aleppo, some are from Cairo, some are from the Gulf, some are from India originally. And but they're all brought together under this framework of Scheherazade telling her husband, the king, these stories so that she has cliffhangers and he won't execute her because he wants to know the end of the story. So Scheherazade is a frame author. She's a fictional frame author, but she's someone to whom all of these tales were attributed. So it gives the work a kind of unity. And I think the same thing was done with Khayyam. He's the Scheherazade of this poetry, that people attributed it to him. I used an Iranian scholar's work who went back and looked at the occurrence of these quatrains, these rubaiyat, in manuscripts of the 1200s. And he found 51 to have emerged in that era. Well, that was the era that the Mongols conquered Iran. And the Mongols were Buddhists. Their rule was the first time that non-Muslims had ruled the lands of Islam. And so I think in this Buddhist-ruled kingdom of Mongol Iran, that there was more room to challenge orthodoxies and conventions, and the poetry grew up initially in that period. And there's also, I think, some Buddhist influence on it, because this idea of the world is fleeting and full of disappointments and pain. These are Buddhist principles, right? It's the Four Holy Truths. So I think you see that in the poetry. And then once the poetry began to be popular and Khayyam was known as a frame author, then in the middle of the 1400s, I think a custom grew up of gathering together a lot of this poetry and publishing it as the Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam. But the poetry is by many different people. I think some of it is by artisans, so some of it is working class poetry. The Marxists should like that. I think some of it may be by women. There was a contemporary of Khayyam at the Seljuk court, Mahsa, who is thought to have been the actual author of some of this poetry. So you had workers, you had women, you had people from all walks of life. Some of the poetry talks about the pains of being poor. So it's not. Khayyam was rich. I mean, he was a court astronomer. He wore finery and silk and got paid 10,000 dinars a year. So the poetry that's coming from a working class milieu obviously never could have been by him. So I think, in medieval Persian and Arabic literature, anthologies were valued because you could read a little bit in them and there would be a little bit of this and a little bit of that, some poetry, some anecdotes. Rumi's Masnavi has this characteristic. Well, in the Rubaiyat, you just have one genre. It's just these quatrains. But I think the way that the anthologists, the editors, got some variety was by collecting different kinds of Rubaiyat, different kinds of quatrains from different kinds of authors. So some of them are Sufi-minded, and some of them are spiritual, and some of them are libertine, and some of them are Epicurean, and so they don't pall. They're not boring.
Yeah, and I guess that also helps you when you're reading the poetry, because in terms of making sense of it, because there are some parts which are contradictory to other parts. But of course, it doesn't all have to fit together because it has these multiple sources. And we have one question from Tabriz, who's asking, well, when we're talking about the Buddhist influence, do you think that the idea about the significance of being in the moment, could that also have some Buddhist genealogy in Khayyam? Buddhist
I think it does. Yes. I mean, I think some of this poetry was probably produced by courtiers for the Mongol kings. And once they had been in Iran for a while, they learned Persian. Ultimately, they converted to Islam, but obviously they would have worn their Islam somewhat lightly, and there would still be a lot of Buddhist influence in it. So I think some of those Buddhist themes are in the poetry because they come out of that milieu.
Yeah. Well, Professor, I guess there are a few parts of the few poems which I had, few verses which I had made note of, which I'd like to bring attention to. There's of course, I mean, there are also some elements which of course you also mentioned that there is also a Sufi influence, and perhaps there has also been an exaggeration in some Middle Eastern and South Asian context where you're trying to read everything of Omar Khayyam in a Sufi context, right? But there's also there's one verse about fate, which strikes me as very similar to a Quranic verse, where so this is on page 68. The very first quatrain: be glad they grew your prophets yesterday. Your hopes and dreams came true in every way. Live happily, since yesterday, before you asked, they said tomorrow's fate for you. The Quran also speaks on one place about fate or destiny, and it says that this is so that you might not grieve over what has occurred. لِكَيْ لَا تَأْسُوا عَلَى مَا فَاتُوا. Right? And this is something which strikes me as a Quranic kind of reading.
Sure. Well, there's a lot of obviously Islamic and Quranic influence in the poetry.
Yeah.
At one point, it swears by the tomb of the prophet,
Yeah.
and we should be aware of that, and for two reasons. One is it is a manifestation of Muslim civilization. It's not something external to it. But also, there is a tendency in, say, the Rumi translations to downplay his Muslimness. Rumi was a qadi, he was a court judge, and very imbricated in Muslim culture and practice, and it's all through his poetry. But the things that became popular in the United States were lyric poetry that was a little bit contextless. And my friend Rosita Ali wrote a piece in which she criticized the American reception of Rumi for stripping out the Muslim elements.
Yeah. Well, of course, the impression there is that Rumi was such a great poet despite or in spite of Islam, not because of Islam.
Yeah, which is silly, of course. He's great. He's a great poet because he sprung from his Islamic context.
There was also this. There's a new. I mean, now it's fairly old, but there was a translation of Farid Attar's Conference of the Birds, which came out by an author who's an American Iranian poet herself. I don't know if you've come across that. I had the chance of posing this question to her in a literature festival in India. That I mean, her response was the sense that these stories are universal stories, and they've been taken from all across civilization and cultures. And in that sense, you don't necessarily need to retain the Islamic garb that they come with in order to, communicate that universal message. Yeah, there could be some use of that as well, I guess.
Well, what she said is perfectly correct. That the reason that we still know Attar's name and Khayyam's name and Rumi's name is that what they did had universal application and resonances. But the universal themes that they address are always clothed in and derived from their own particular context. And I think one shouldn't hit the reader over the head with too many details. It shouldn't be made so complex as to become off-putting. But I think where there was a clear Muslim referent in the poetry, I tried to retain it because I thought it's important that the American reader know where this is coming from.
Yeah, I guess that must have been like a tension during translation because some of these terms which are used are symbols. I mean, one term is a symbol, and if you translate it in colloquial English, then perhaps you might deprive it of that broader symbolic significance which it contains. For example, a term like Saki, for example, which is quite symbolic, right? So how did you navigate that tension?
Yeah, well, in some instances, I just sacrificed the original context rather than writing a book for the English-speaking reader on what a Saki was. I wanted this poetry to speak to contemporaries, and my publisher called it an aggressively modern translation. And I had some fights with my editors at some points about some of these things. So I don't know about you, but I've never been in a tavern. I don't think people know, especially like the Gen X and I mean the contemporary youth know what a tavern is.
Yeah.
And so I tried to come up with words. I was forbidden to call it a bar, which is what I wanted to do, but a drinkery and so forth. So with regard to the Saki, who in medieval Persian poetry more generally, and in Sufi poetry in particular, the young man who brings you the wine in the tavern, when it's viewed symbolically, becomes an angel, right? Because the wine is the intoxication of God. But in secular poetry, where there was a lot of experimentation with sexuality, the young man could be a love object. Well, I had to sacrifice all that. It was just too much to get into. So I just called the person a server or that kind of thing. At one point, I call the person a barkeep. A barkeeper in American and British English is a recognizable figure. And I thought that's good because if you had a female barkeeper, she's the one who makes your drink. And then a lot of guys will pour out their hearts to her. So she's kind of a confidant. So I thought maybe in a contemporary secular American context, the barkeep may be the closest you get to some of the resonances of the Saki and medieval Persian literature. But I wanted the poetry to speak to contemporaries. I mean, we had Fitzgerald's translation, which is a little bit inexact at some points, but it captures the spirit. But it's now, I think, a little hard to read because it's so couched in Victorian language. So I wanted this to be in fresh contemporary idiom.
There's also another reason which you mentioned at the end of the book that if we try to retain these foreign terms, then we risk portraying this tradition as an other or an orient, and that only alienates the two traditions from each other, the two cultures from each other. So in that sense of a mutual dialogue and in a sense of seeing this as not an alien or a foreign thing, but something which can speak to you as well on a personal level. So yeah, I guess that's also a really important aspect of thinking about how to translate it. Yeah.
Yeah, I didn't want it to be off-putting in any way. I didn't want it to strike people as something difficult to get into or somehow, as you say, alien. And the poetry is not. The original Persian of this poetry is very simple. And specialists in Persian literature of the time talked about how rubaiyat are so popular because the common people enjoy their simplicity. And so some of Fitzgerald's renderings are very Latin. He was, as a 19th century British gentleman, he was steeped in Greek and Latin and sometimes very kind of, I would say, awkward phraseology is used. And I wanted the simpleness and the directness and the freshness and the power of the poetry just to come through in the English as far as I could. So I tried to avoid Latin-rooted words. It's very Hemingway-esque, my approach. It's mostly English roots.
Well, let me also bring out some other points which I had made note of, if you allow. So, well, I guess, I mean, in terms of the poetry which really spoke to me was, I mean, an important part is that because everything is meaningless does not mean that you behave immorally or you abandon all sense of virtue, but precisely because nothing matters at the ultimately. So don't make your ego also matter and behave well with others. I mean, I guess this is this could sum up what Khayyam is trying to say. Khayyami poetry says, be happy and live justly. Right? And well, there's also, I guess, Professor, we've touched upon a lot of the important themes of your book, and in conclusion, there was this part of your book right at the end of it, which I think is a fitting conclusion for our own discussion as well, where you mentioned that this is on page 144, where you're talking about this secular Muslim counterculture in the medieval Middle East. And so I'll just read out from here. You say that Western thinkers believe that they invented modern secularism from the 18th century forward, and that the Muslim world lacked the concept and was mired in piety that then and even until today. In actuality, Europe in the age of Inquisition would never have allowed the freewheeling Khayyami sort of poetry, whereas it flourished in West, Central, and South Asia.
Yeah, I mean, the Muslim world did not have a centralized Inquisition the way the Roman Catholic world did. So people who went around openly proclaiming these kinds of values, at least in many parts of medieval Europe, would have ended up being charged with heresy and burned at the stake. I think medieval Muslim civilization was much looser. It wasn't so centralized, and there was room for individualism and expression of unconventional values. Not everywhere. There were occasionally heresy trials, and people could get into trouble. Sometimes poets got caught because they did the Khayyami kind of poetry under a ruler who kind of liked it. And then if that ruler was replaced by another one who was more puritanical, then they would be in trouble. But on the whole and by and large, I think there were many spaces in medieval Muslim civilization for people to act and think and write in unconventional ways, much more so than in more centralized and regimented Europe.
Yeah. And I think that's also an important point in the present context of modern day Iran, and the fact that Omar Khayyam and this the Khayyami poetry is from the same place where modern day Iran, and that just shows how our own context in history is a unique one, and it's a fairly recent or modern one, and this culture has given birth to or allowed to flourish various other strains as well.
Yes, the contemporary Islamic Republic of Iran is a very modern experiment. It's using the tools of the modern state to implement a vision of Islamic law and Islamic behavior, which, the trope is, the convention is that this is a revival of medieval society before the Western impact. But in fact, there was nothing like this in the medieval period. The Islamic Republic, for its first decades, didn't even dare try to ban the Rubaiyat, which is very popular in Iran. I found on YouTube, a recording of pearl divers from Bosher who had a kind of Khayyam society, and they were singing this poetry. But in 2008, I think the regime did issue some kind of decree against the poetry. Since people memorize it and it can be oral, whether you can print the book or not is kind of irrelevant. I think people still cultivate it.
Well, Professor, I guess that's a good way to end the discussion. Yeah. I'd just like to remind for those of the viewers who aren't aware that we had done a previous discussion with the professor on his other book on the Prophet of Islam, Muhammad, which was quite an in-depth and a wide-ranging conversation that we had. And if you haven't checked that out, do make sure to check it out. And do make sure to buy that book, as well as this one, the Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam, which is available in India, as well as the US and the UK, as well as on Kindle. And Professor, thank you for your time. Thank you for your generous time.
Thank you very much, Saad. This is always a great stop for me, and I appreciate the sparkling conversation.
Thank you. Hassan Bhai, are you still here? Let me just remind him to close the live stream. Yeah, so Professor, while we were just beginning this conversation, you mentioned that you're also working on this new book, which tries to sketch out in more detail the influence that Khayyam had on the European intellectual scene.
Yeah.
Hi guys. Now I was just saying that I'm here. I was waiting for you guys to finish, then I'll end your live stream. So I think you're done, right?
Right.
So I was just getting ready to end it. So I didn't mean to.
Go ahead and end it. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Thanks. And I'm like totally informal, so I'm forced to expose my informality today. But thank you so much, Professor Cole. Real pleasure and joy and honor to have you on again. And sorry, Sad, I didn't mean to cut you off, but like, yeah. Okay. All right. Talk again soon. God bless you both and everyone. Thank you so much. Bye now.
Thank you.
Yeah, Saad, I have this book in hand, and I've written some chapters, but it's so tough because the poetry went everywhere, and focusing in on a particular writer or subject is hard. And then I keep finding new things, like we were talking about Thomas Hardy. So he has that novel, Jude the Obscure. And I just read a journal article that suggests that it was inspired by the Rubaiyat. So having to go and study Hardy and all of he wrote these big novels and so forth. I think this book may take a while.
Yeah.
And then I found that the beat poets, we had the beatnik movement in the 50s before the hippies, and Jack Kerouac was deeply influenced by it. So it's kind of protean. I have to find a way to zero in on some particular subjects.
No, I think that's one of the most fascinating parts of the book, which I found. And I think it's well worth putting this out and bringing this out. And
well, I'm committed to doing it. It just may take a while.
Of course, yeah. Okay, thank you, Professor.
Okay, all the best. Take care.
Thank you.
Oh, and when you've got this on YouTube, send me the link, and I'll do what I did before. I'll mirror it at my blog.
That was really helpful.
I can reach tens of thousands of people. I hope I sent you some new viewers.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, it was really helpful that you did that, and we got a good number of views.
Good. Yeah. We'll do it again.
Take
care. And Eid Mubarak.
Thank you very much.